In this video, I want to talk about the important principle of medical device equivalence, which is a principle that's existed in one form or another for some time, both in European medical device legislation and similar legislation elsewhere in the world. The idea behind equivalence is that a manufacturer of a medical device can essentially borrow clinical data relating to a very similar alternative device in order to justify regulatory alignment of their own device. So it can save considerable costs in terms of clinical evidence generation and other forms of the regulatory process. Now, this used to be used quite widely, but the opportunities for using equivalence under the MDR have been quite considerably constrained, and that probably related to overuse or unreasonable use of equivalence in the past. So in the MDR, equivalence can be thought of as similarities between two devices such that there will be no real difference in terms of their clinical safety and performance profile. So it requires close alignment between two devices. What we need to discuss is the three domains in which equivalence needs to be demonstrated, and then some important parameters in relation to access to data that can affect the implementation of equivalence in practice. So there are three domains in which device A needs to be demonstrated to be equivalent to device B. So these are equivalence in terms of technical, biological, and clinical characteristics. So let's just go through each of those in turn. So technical characteristics relate to things like the design and conditions of use of the device. It also relates to physical specification and properties such as surface properties, viscosity, strength, and so on. And also extends to principles of operation of the device. So that can be contrasted with biological characteristics, which relate to the interaction of specific parts of a device or substances with the human body or with tissues of the human body. So this is more biologically relevant, as you'd expect from the title, and extends also to not only the type of interaction with human tissues, but also the duration. So devices would need to be the same in terms of all of those. So the part of the device that's contacting human tissue, for how long and under what conditions. The other aspect to biological equivalence is in relation to substances that may be released by a device. Under the MDR, where substances are intended to be absorbed or locally dispersed, there's now a requirement that the substances are exactly the same, whereas previously they could just be similar. So biological similarity or equivalence has really tightened under the MDR. So technical is in relation to physical properties and conditions of use. Biological is in relation to interaction between parts of the device or substances with human tissues. And that leaves clinical characteristics. Well, these relate in many ways to the target clinical condition and also the intended use population. And provisions are quite specific. So it's not enough to say, well, device A is to treat mild osteoarthritis and device B is to treat severe osteoarthritis, so it's osteoarthritis and their equivalent. That doesn't work. It needs to be a similar level of disease severity or a very close level of disease severity in the same type of population for the same reasons and with the same expected clinical effect. So clinical characteristics need to be very similar in order to meet the test for clinical equivalence. Let's assume that two devices are similar or equivalent in terms of their technical, biological, and clinical characteristics. At this point, our work isn't done because there are additional requirements in terms of access to data whereby the manufacturer of the device under evaluation can show that they have good reasons for assuming or claiming equivalence to the other device. So these are in relation to access to technical files and data relating to the equivalent device. Consider, first of all, there are different rules for implantable and class 3 devices as opposed to all the others. So let's take the implantable and class 3 devices first. In this case, the baseline expectation is that all implantable and class 3 devices will be subjected to their own clinical investigation. But in the case of equivalence, where the need to do that is hopefully going to be avoided, it's not enough just to point to data relating to the equivalent device. Actually, there needs to be a contract in place between the two manufacturers granting full access to the data, not just the summary data that might be in a clinical paper, but the data that underpins that in a raw form. And so if you think about the fact that in many cases an equivalent device will be manufactured by a competitor, having a contract in place to access all of their data is, to all intents and purposes, impossible or inconceivable. So this really closes down the opportunity to claim equivalence for implantable or class 3 devices under the MDR. For all other devices, there's still a requirement that there's an agreement for access to sufficient data. So there doesn't necessarily need to be a contract in place, but there would need to be a justification that the level of access to data relating to the equivalent device is sufficient to justify that claim of equivalence. So there's some scope for manoeuvre there, but once again, the bottom line is that claiming equivalence for any device under the MDR is far more difficult than it used to be, because in the case of an equivalent device made by a competitor, it's very rare that access to any data at all would be granted other than that that's already in the public domain. So to summarise this discussion on equivalence, there are 3 domains for equivalence. That's technical, biological and clinical characteristics, all of which must be very similar in order to claim equivalence, and in many cases must be exactly the same. The other component is in relation to access to data, and that's more stringent, requiring a contract for implantable and class 3 devices, but must be of a level that's justifiable for all other devices. The final thing to say about equivalence is that it is possible to claim equivalence to more than one equivalent device if there's a feeling that that would be helpful. But in this case, it's not possible to just pick and choose individual aspects of the purportedly equivalent devices. All of device B must be equivalent to device A, and all of device C must be equivalent to device A. It's not okay to just borrow individual parts of each, hoping that matching this part with this part will form a whole. That won't work under the MDR. Each purportedly equivalent device has to be equivalent in all 3 domains that we discussed before. So I hope that's a useful summary of equivalence under the MDR, and we'll see you in another video.